Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this side event, which is being offered by the Religious Freedom Institute, Ukraine, Religious Freedom Under Fire. Certainly a conflict that is very much at the front of mind and for all of us, and certainly these past few months as it's accelerated. My name is Father Deacon Andrew Bennett. I'm a senior fellow with the Religious Freedom Institute here in Washington, D.C., and I'm also a deacon of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Eparchy of Toronto and Eastern Canada, which you will know by my vowel pronunciation. It's a pleasure to have our guest with us today. We're just waiting, hopefully, the arrival of Ambassador Andriy Yurash, who's the Ukrainian ambassador to the Holy See. Just trying to get him linked up. But by way of introduction, I'd just like to provide some context for our event this afternoon. The religious dimensions of the present war in Ukraine are vastly underreported and not very well understood, particularly in the mainstream media, in the mainstream commentariat. And so part of the goal of this session is to try and remedy that to a certain extent. To understand the nature of the present war in Ukraine, one can certainly look through a geopolitical lens. One can look through a somewhat hackneyed East versus West lens. One can try to understand it from an economic perspective. But really, without the deep historical and ecclesial knowledge of the complex religious dimensions, both in Ukraine and in Russia, one cannot fully understand the nature of this conflict. Ukraine is really, the present-day Ukraine is the heartland of Christianity as it came into the Eastern Slavic lands at the time of the conversion of Kievan Rus in 988. That historical reality, the conversion of Kievan Rus under Grand Prince Volodymyr in 988, really is at the core of what this conflict is about, and as how Russia sees it and how Ukraine sees it. And we'll get into a number of different topics that relate to that reality, such as the doctrine of Ruski Mir that has been propagated by the Russian Orthodox Church and certainly by the Kremlin. But also to understand the very different dimensions of religious freedom in Russia and Ukraine. It's really a tale of sort of a monism, we might say, in Russia, where there is the official Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate, with a very close relationship to the state, not simply a Byzantine sort of symphonia, as we might have understood, but really a very deep and close relationship with the state, and a rather intolerant attitude towards other religious communities. And certainly we've seen how various government restrictions in Russia have impacted a wide array of religious communities, including the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, various evangelical Protestant denominations, and certainly the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which essentially exists as an underground church in present-day Russia. In contrast, Ukraine has what we might term a very healthy confessionalism, where there's a wide variety of different religious traditions that are able to engage with one another, not simply privately, but also in the public square. And that reality, that very healthy confessionalism that is typified by the All-Ukraine Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, which is very different from the reality in Russia, really is also a seminal reality in terms of the religious life within Ukraine, especially since independence. And so we need to sort of understand this tale of two ecclesiologies, this tale of two religious identities between Russia and Ukraine. And so we're very fortunate this afternoon, to have some of the leading experts on religious freedom in Ukraine and on the nature of this conflict, its religious dimensions. And I think we're probably still awaiting Ambassador Yurash. So I think what we'll probably do is launch into a bit of a discussion on what are some of these key issues that are at play, so we can better understand, again, these religious dimensions of this conflict. So I'd like to just briefly introduce our panel, going from my immediate left. So first I'd like to introduce Lauren Homer. And Lauren is an international attorney who has represented religious and faith-based nonprofits internationally since 1990. And in that same year, she founded Law and Liberty Trust to advocate for international religious freedom, democracy, and rule of law in countries emerging from totalitarian governance. And she's worked in countries as diverse as Russia, Ukraine, other former Soviet republics, China, the Middle East, and recently dealing with the challenges faced by religious minorities in Afghanistan. She's a member of the steering committee of the IRF Roundtable and is co-chair of its Middle East Working Group. She's also head of the IRF Roundtable's Emergency Task Force on Afghanistan that was formed just after the resurgent Taliban takeover in August of last year, and is also engaged very actively on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. To her immediate left is my RFI colleague, Todd Huizinga. Todd is the president and executive director for the Center for Transatlantic Renewal, a U.S. diplomat from 1992 to 2012. Todd served as deputy chief of mission or chief of mission in Luxembourg, the European Union, and was also consul for political and economic affairs for U.S. consulates in Hamburg, Munich, and consul for public affairs, the U.S. consulate in Monterrey, Mexico. He's also served in Dublin, Frankfurt, Costa Rica. Wide experience in the diplomatic world, but Todd is really immersed in the politics of Europe. He's the author of The New Totalitarian Temptation, Global Governance and the Crisis of Democracy in Europe. He's also served as Senior Research Fellow at the Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he was the Director of International Outreach for the Acton Institute from 2014 to 2016. And as I mentioned, he's closely affiliated with RFI as a Senior Fellow and also Europe Major Domo, I think is the best title. Immediately to Todd's left, I'm happy to welcome, if I can just find the correct bio, Pastor Igor Bandura. Pastor Bandura is the first vice president of the All-Ukrainian Union of Churches of Evangelical Christians and Baptists, the largest Protestant denomination in Ukraine, and he's been in that position since 2014. He previously served as its vice president. Following the commencement of Russia's attack and invasion of Ukraine, after he evacuated his own family, Pastor Bandura has worked tirelessly on provision of humanitarian aid through the network of Baptist churches in Ukraine and with the assistance from various foreign organizations, and is also seeking to organize his church's spiritual and moral response to the crisis. He's a graduate of the Odessa Theological Seminary and also has a background in music education. And last but not least, Alexander Zayats. Alexander is the chairman of the board of the Institute for Religious Freedom, which is based in Kyiv. He's been actively involved in issues of religious freedom or belief and state-church relations since the mid-1990s. Since 2004, he's been the executive secretary of the Council of Representatives of Christian Churches of Ukraine. He works actively as a consultant, including as serving as a member of the Working Group for Freedom of Worship under the Secretariat of the President of Ukraine. He's participated in the development of several draft documents, laws, and amendments to laws which deal with freedom of conscience matters in Ukraine. And from 2009 to 2010, he worked as an advisor to the first vice prime minister of Ukraine. He's a member of the Commission on Implementation of the Rights of Religious Organizations and the Commission for Humanitarian Help under the government of Ukraine. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. So I'd like to maybe just ask for each of our panelists maybe just to offer a few comments in the way of sort of 2 to 3 minutes, giving their perspective on the current situation. Then we'll lead into a broader discussion. So maybe I can ask Lauren to address us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. I began working on religious freedom in former Soviet republics in 1990, so it's 32 years ago. So I feel like I was really there at the beginning And I'm glad I was there at the beginning because there were some wonderful times, whereas right now we're seeing a horrible crisis, almost unbelievable inhumane actions by the Russian government against the people of Ukraine. In 1992, when the Soviet Union collapsed, by the way, by agreement between Russia and Ukraine, among other Soviet republics, religious freedom was handed to them on a silver platter. All of the laws of the Soviet Union were tossed out. All the registrations of religious organizations were tossed out. Everything had to start again. And at first, Russia really embraced religious freedom. I had an office in the Institute of Marx, Lenin, and Engels, and we took over the Journal of the History of the CPSU and turned it into a magazine about democracy and new ideas for Christian Foundation for Democracy in Russia. That's how open everything was. But immediately the reactionary forces tried to change things, tried to restrict laws. I was privileged to be part of a group of people who not only represented faith-based organizations from outside those countries in registration, but to work with leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, and other advocates on really turning religious freedom legislation into a reality. And so we immediately saw in the beginning that things were going to be very different in Ukraine than they were in Russia. Of course, it had so much to do with the history of the two countries and the fact that Ukraine had been subjugated for so long by the Soviet Union, but people still had a memory of what it was like to be free, it seemed. And so we would bring, like, the chief regulator of religious affairs in Ukraine to Moscow to talk to people about how they dealt with, so-called cults and some real terrible cults, death cults, but in a way that was not heavy-handed, where they explained things to people and they changed their minds. So some of the others are going to talk about the history since 1992 of how religious affairs regulation evolved in Ukraine. But I think it's just such a clear example of why religious freedom is so important. That Ukraine embraced it, they made it their own, they chose pluralism and diversity and freedom of conscience above totalitarianism and subjugation, whereas things unfortunately have really gone in the opposite direction in Russia, to where Father Bennett mentioned Symphonia, but in some ways the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate has become practically more than a branch of the Russian government. It's just integral to its interests. A couple of years ago, they dedicated a military cathedral outside of Moscow, and they actually have, instead of icons on the walls, pictures of the military leaders that invaded Ukraine in 2014. I mean, it's a really terrible story. But I think that our Ukrainian guests and Dr. Husinka can very clearly go through some of the other history, and I'll just stop there for now.
So now I'll pass it to Todd Huizinga, who's going to talk a little bit about the geopolitical dimensions, but also the impact of this conflict, I think, on Europe and religious freedom in the region.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to concentrate just a little bit in my short remarks about Russia's cultural religious justification for its attack on Ukraine, its war against Ukraine. And so Russia's relations with the West in general, I don't want to change this into an East-West thing, but nevertheless, Russia's relations with the West in general, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, have had a very important, and do have a very important, cultural religious aspect. Russia's enmity with the West, and now its enmity against Ukraine, is not just a political enmity, not just a military enmity, but also a religious, cultural enmity. And that plays a huge role in Russia's justification for what it is doing in Ukraine. This is encapsulated in an idea that Father Deacon Andrew mentioned in his opening remarks, namely the idea of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And I think a large part of this very complex and yet nebulous idea is the idea of Russia as a Christian bulwark against the decadent post-Christian West. And in Ukraine, Russia as a Christian bulwark against the West, protecting Ukraine from the decadent post-Christian West that it threatens to join. Russia has set itself up in many ways as a protector against the breakdown of the traditional family, traditional marriage, traditional sexuality as it's happening in the West. So the Ruski Mir it's hard to say exactly whether it's mainly cultural, whether it's mainly religious, because again, it's a very nebulous mixture of everything. But a key to that is that the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, stands for a unity. There is a mystical, cultural, religious unity, not only among Russians, but among all Russian speakers, and especially among all Russian speakers in Russia's near abroad. And Ukraine, of course, plays a huge role in that in Russia's near abroad. The Russian Orthodox Church plays a huge role in this idea of this Russian mystical unity, this Ruski Mir. And Ukraine, and again I'm going to refer to something that Father Deacon Andrew just mentioned, Ukraine is absolutely at the center of this idea of the Russian world, the Ruski Mir, because the official birth, let's say, of Russian Orthodoxy and of the Ruski Mir occurred in Ukraine in 988, when Prince Vladimir the Great converted to Christianity, was baptized, and that then was followed by a mass baptism in Kiev called the Baptism of Rus, 988. The beginning, in a certain sense, of Russian Orthodoxy. And it happened in present-day Ukraine. And so the interesting and at the same time nefarious thing is that Russia, which has made itself into quite an enemy of religious freedom, is playing the protector of religion in Ukraine, the protector of religion against the West. We probably won't have time to go into this, but this includes many of Russia's actions in international fora, such as in the UN, where Russia has allied with other groups as the protector of the traditional family, traditional morality, etc., against the more secularized European Union countries and the US under democratic administrations to protect traditional morality. And so you have this very, very ironic situation in which Russia, in attacking Ukraine and in threatening religious freedom in Ukraine, is actually doing so under the claim that it is protecting Ukraine against the post-Christian decadent West. Thank you.
Greeting to all of you. We are from Ukraine. This simple and obvious phrase became very special for us. It belongs to one of our governor. He was speaking every night to the people in his city when the city, Mykolaiv, was surrounded by Russian army in that very beginning of the war. And in that phrase was optimism and strong belief that God would not forsake Ukraine and Ukraine would survive. Ukraine would not surrender. And in the end, Ukraine will win. So this very simple phrase, which served before that like the way of introduction or to say we are from Ukraine, now have a special meaning. We are from Ukraine. It means we are people of faith, optimism, and we believe Ukraine will not only survive but also would win. I'm representing the Baptist community of Ukraine. As Ukrainian Baptist Union of Ukraine, we are members of all Ukrainian Union of Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, which unite not only Christian churches but also Muslim community and Jewish community. And we stay in solidarity and we have mutual respect, and we work with many questions in the spirit of unity. And in this spirit of unity, we speak with our president, our parliament, and we are working to stand for religious freedom issues in Ukraine. And it is quite successful. And this Council of Churches and Religious Organization also speaks about the almost unbelievably good situation with religious freedom in Ukraine. But situation is completely different in the territories that are taken by Russian army. Ukraine is a territory of freedom. I remember in 2014, after the Revolution of Dignity, somebody put huge poster which says, "Freedom is our religion." As a Christian pastor, I would not share this conviction because freedom is not our religion. But that posters, on one side it was huge in Ukrainian, and on the other side it was in English. It expressed something very unique about Ukrainians. We love freedom. We would fight for freedom. And this is why we are fighting with Russian army, which is much, much stronger. Because we understand that if we lose the battle, we would not have Ukraine anymore. And if we would not have Ukraine, we would forget about freedom, and especially about freedom of religious. Because freedom of religious, freedom of conscience, stopped to exist in every single place that was occupied by Russian army. What is going on? Why it is so important for us to win the war? The answer is very simple, in fact. If Russia win, Ukraine would disappear. Freedom would disappear. Unfortunately, now these two words, Russia and religious freedom, is mutually exclusive. For Russia, it is existential. What was already mentioned, our history, which goes deep to 988, is basically Ukrainian history. First of all, it is history of Kiev. It is history of Kiev, Rus, not Russian world, not Ruski Mir. The big problem of Ruski Mir, this ideology or idea of Russian world, which is considered by all our Orthodox churches and Greek Catholic churches, I understand, as heresy, as modern heresy. The problem is that one of the father of the ideology of Ruski Mir is Russian Patriarch Kirill. So here you have this combination of state and Orthodox Church. And both of them, it is evident, are standing against freedom and against freedom of conscience. Because Russian President Putin started the war against Ukraine, and Russian Patriarch Kirill blessed the war and blessed the Russian army to fight against Ukrainians. Ukrainians, among them are still many members of Russian Orthodox Church or Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. So basically, this is why we are talking about existential problem. Russia is trying to steal our history and our religious and cultural identity. It seems like they cannot find their own identity without our Ukrainian history. They do not see their future without Ukraine being a part of Russia. And this is existential problem. It's not just about the territories, goods, or economical means, natural resources. It is about existential things. And this is why it relates directly to the issues of freedom and religious freedom. This leads also to the attempt of genocide of Ukrainians, because Russian president believes that there is not such a nation as Ukrainians. There is not such a country. So you are either agree with him and become part of his world, or he would destroy you. And for all of us religious leaders, it was clear and understandable that if Russia would take Ukraine, we would be either killed or we would have to escape from the country to save our life. So for us, this battle is not only for life. It is for our existence. It is about our freedom. It is about our future and future of our children. We are observing the effects of deportation to Russia and following doom perspective for the people. People are forcefully moved to Russia. Orphans are taken and deported to Russia to be adopted by Russian families. The country that sends soldiers to fight against Ukraine without any justified reason will never respect the concept of freedom. The country that tolerates the act of genocide and cruelty of her soldiers, that kill innocent civilians, rape women and teenage girls, destroyed cities, towns, villages, infrastructure, will never respect freedom. So the war that we are fighting against is not only about our life and our country. It is about basic values, foundational values of our life, our existence. It is about freedom, and it is about freedom of religions. President Putin wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. I was born in that empire. I was 21 years old when it collapsed, and I don't remember there was religious freedom in that empire. And the situation with my parents and with the parents of my parents was even much, much worse. I don't believe if Russia would build something, there would be place for religious freedom in that construction. This is why people flee from any place Russians are coming. Just imagine 14 million of people had to leave their places and their houses and save their lives. More than 7 million, mostly women and children, had to go abroad. It is interesting, the first thing that Russians do when they occupy a territory, they start to bring back Soviet Union symbols. They bring back street names with names of leaders of communistic time, and they put Lenin statues back to their places. So this is why we believe this is the utmost threat to freedom, including religious freedom. And this is why we are grateful for this invitation to come and speak and share what, in the essence, is going on in Ukraine and how it can influence our daily life and our future. This fight is fight for freedom and religious freedom. So thank you so much for standing in solidarity with Ukrainians. Please stand with us right to the end. I mean, the day of the victory.
Добрий день.
Hello,
Ми з України.
we are from Ukraine.
Ми дуже вдячні вам за те, що ви знайшли час і можливість відвідати цю панель.
We are very thankful to you for finding the time to come and listen to us and have this conversation.
Ми дякуємо за ваш інтерес до України,
We are thankful for your interest to Ukraine,
до війни, за незалежність і свободу, яка зараз веде Україну проти російської агресії.
and to the war that Ukraine is fighting for its freedom and independence against Russian aggression.
Ця війна, вона також затронула і релігійну сферу України.
Yes, this war touches upon the religious sphere of Ukraine as well.
Україна має демократичне законодавство в сфері релігійної свободи.
Ukraine has a democratic legislation on issues of religious freedom.
Україна мала до війни високий рівень релігійної свободи, який зберігається і зараз, незважаючи на певні обмеження, пов'язані з війною та військовим станом.
So before the war, Ukraine did have a high level of religious freedom, and it still is maintained despite the wartime situation.
Україна є поліконфесійною країною, в якій вільно сповідують і поширюють свою віру різні конфесії.
Ukraine is a multi-denominational country. I think I'll stand here. A multi-denominational.
Різні церкви та релігійні організації є невід'ємною частиною громадянського суспільства України.
And religion is an organic, intrinsic part of Ukraine's civil society.
Всеукраїнська рада церков і релігійних організацій, про яку згадував пастор Ігор, є основним суб'єктом міжконфесійного діалогу та державно-конфесійних відносин.
The Council of Churches and Religious Organizations that Pastor Igor is a member of is the key platform for this interdenominational discussion.
Кілька років в Україні існує також круглий стіл з релігійної свободи, до якого залучені представники різних релігійних груп.
In addition, Ukraine has had a roundtable on religious freedoms for several years now, and representatives of different religious groups are involved there.
У 2014-2015 роках російська агресія проти України супроводжувалася грубими порушеннями релігійної свободи на тимчасово окупованих територіях України.
Russian aggression against Ukraine that started in 2014 in 2015 was accompanied by manifestations of violations of religious freedom in the occupied territories.
Це було викрадення, катування та позасудові розстріли священнослужителів і віруючих різних церков.
This included kidnappings, tortures, and extrajudicial killings of religious workers and priests.
У такий спосіб Росія насаджувала свою владу на тимчасово окупованих українських територіях.
This was the way for Russia to impose its power on the occupied territories.
Детально про ці події тих років зазначено в звітах Інституту релігійної свободи, які були видані в 2015-2018 роках.
Those events are reported in detail in the reports of the Institute of Religious Freedom that came out in 2015 and 2016.
З перших днів повномасштабного російського вторгнення в Україну Інститут релігійної свободи розпочав моніторинг та збір даних про вплив війни на релігійні громади в Україні.
And from the very first days of Russia's overall full-scale invasion, our institute began to monitor and collect information on religious freedom situation.
Ми опитали певну кількість національних та місцевих лідерів релігійних об'єднань в Україні.
We surveyed leaders of religious organizations.
Та зняли відеосвідчення релігійних діячів щодо цілеспрямованих обстрілів культових споруд та нападів на релігійних діячів і активістів.
We video recorded testimonies of religious workers and leaders about targeted shellings and fire on places of worship.
В липні цього року ми плануємо видати цей звіт, який буде поширений в соціальних мережах.
Our next report will be released in July and it'll be accessible in social media.
Коли ми порівнюємо гоніння, які були на релігійних діячів в 2014-2015 роках і зараз, то слід відмітити, що те, що відбувається зараз, це набагато жорстокіше.
And if we compare the persecutions of religious leaders that took place in 2014 and 15 to compare to what's going on now, the situation now is a lot more cruel and terrible.
Тобто зараз відбуваються обстріли культових споруд.
So the events these days include directed attacks on places of worship,
захоплення представників конфесій на тимчасово окупованих територій, потім з ними ведуть бесіди представники спеціальних служб, і вони примушують цих людей до того, щоб вони підписували певні папери для співпраці з цими службами.
and then religious leaders are captured and interrogated by Russian security service, who force them to sign papers giving agreement to some kind of collaboration.
Мають також місце вбивства представників конфесії або релігійних представників. Зокрема, один релігійний волонтер, який віз гуманітарну допомогу на Київщині в одне з сел, він був вбитий російськими солдатами, і кілька днів його не хоронили. Він просто лежав на узбіччі дороги, і тільки потім мешканці того села, куди він віз цю гуманітарну допомогу, вони змогли його поховати.
There was instances registered and reported of killings of religious workers and activists. One volunteer, religious volunteer who was delivering humanitarian aid to villages, got killed by Russian soldiers, and for several days his body laid unburied at the side of the road.
На окупованих територіях зараз відкрито реалізується імперіалістична політика Росії, заснована на ідеології руського міра.
And Russian imperialist policy based on this concept of Russian world is now being implemented in the occupied territories.
Цю ідеологію активно поширював патріарх Кирил.
Patriarch Kirill was promoting this ideology.
Також колишній голова зовнішнього відділу Руської православної церкви митрополит Іларіон Алфеєв, який минулого року маніпулятивно виступав на одному з заходів саміту в минулому році.
Same as Metropolitan Ilarion, who is the former chief of external relations for the Russian Orthodox Church, who promoted these ideas, and he made provocative statements at one of international forums some time ago.
Російська військова авіація та артилерія, як я казав, знищують культові споруди, незалежно від їх мови, конфесії та етнічної приналежності.
As I said before, Russian Air Force and artillery are destroying places of worship, no matter what language they use and what denomination they belong to.
Руйнуються також багато храмів, які належать до Української православної церкви в єдності з Московським патріархатом. Тобто ніякої мови про захист, так би мовити, одновірців в Україні не може бути.
Their claims about protection of religion in Ukraine are totally phony, because many of the churches they have been destroying belong to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is subordinated to Russian to Moscow.
Приклади масових руйнувань, як от Буча, Ірпінь, Маріуполь, Харків, дозволяють зробити висновок, що Росія швидше зруйнує цілі міста та знищить українську історичну та духовну спадщину, ніж визнає право українського народу на самовизначення та суверенітет.
Mass destruction of places like Bucha and Irpin and others that are now world famous clearly shows us that Russia would rather destroy Ukrainian communities than accept their freedom and independence.
Тому ми переконані, що всі ці злочини мають бути задокументовані.
Which is why we are convinced that all those crimes have to be properly recorded and reported on the standards of international law.
На завершення хотів би сказати, що церкви, вони роблять величезний обсяг роботи по наданню гуманітарної допомоги населенню.
In conclusion, I want to say that churches in Ukraine are doing tremendous amount of work to help the civilians.
Допомагають в евакуації людей.
To help evacuate people when needed.
На цьому хотів би завершити. Я думаю, що якщо будуть якісь запитання, можна буде більш конкретно відповісти.
I will stop here. I'll be glad to answer your questions.
Дякую за увагу.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Дуже дякую. So now we are joined by His Excellency Ambassador Andriy Yurash, who is Ukraine's ambassador to the Holy See. He's held that position since December of 2021. Ambassador Yurash is a Ukrainian religious scholar, political scientist, expert in state-church relations, sociology, geography, religion, among other disciplines. He served as the director of the Department of Religious and Ethnic Affairs of the Ministry of Culture in Ukraine from 2014 to 2020, and as head of its successor organization, the Department of Religious Affairs of the Cabinet of Ministers Secretariat. In 2006, he was appointed a member of the Working Group on Religious Freedom under the President of Ukraine. Your Excellency, it's a pleasure to have you joining us today virtually. The virtual microphone is yours. Proszę.
Thank you again. Dear honorable organizers and participants of today's important panel dedicated to Ukraine. First of all, I would like to express my deepest appreciation for inviting me to participate in this meeting. Secondly, I want to confirm how valuable from absolutely different approaches this panel is. The topic to which the panel is dedicated is extremely significant, not just for the United States and for Ukraine, but for the rest of the world as well. On the political scale, many leaders of different countries are speaking now about significance of Ukraine in terms of their world product stability. They are trying to provide and secure so-called wheat corridors to guarantee peoples in many countries in Asia and Africa to live without danger of hunger. Ukraine knows what big hunger means. In 1932, 1933, from 5 till 7 million of Ukrainians died from starvation organized by the Soviet Stalin's regime. That's why Ukraine is doing, even in current extremely difficult circumstances of war and everyday bombing, everything possible to share with the rest of the world that stocks of grain that we have. But at the same time, Ukraine and Ukrainians understand completely how important for maintaining own tradition and stability, as well as even for preserving our independence, other issue is the issue of religious freedom and religious plurality. Probably you can ask me why I am making this comparison between world product issue and the issue of religious freedom. First of all, because two measures of the world situation and stability are incredibly important. Secondly, because both issues now are dependent from the situation in my country, in Ukraine. And thirdly, because these two crises that affect at this moment so many countries, almost in all parts of the world, have been created by the same totalitarian state, Russia. Everybody knows perfectly what kind of situation with the issue of securing religious rights is in Russia. From my side, it's not a question, and it is a statement at the same time. Thousands of religious texts are completely prohibited with a strange and undefined correctly definition as extremist literature. Some religious institutions are completely prohibited, like Society of Jehovah's Witnesses and activity of dozens of other religious organization institutions are under complete state control and meet terrible limitations in its everyday activity. Hundreds of religious activists are in prisons. One religious organization endowed with extraordinary rights and affects not just other spheres of public life, including political and military ones, but affects also life and level of real freedom for all other religious bodies in the country. I am absolutely sure that you know perfectly that religious organization in Russia, what kind of religious organization I am talking about. So, acting according to the totalitarian principles concerning religious organizations in its own territory, this type of states like Russia use absolutely terroristic methods in its relation with other states and toward religious institutions of these other states. Russia is extremely demonstrative example of this type. From one hand, it doesn't want to recognize and follow principles of religious freedom toward religious organization inside the country. From other hand, Russia has started unjustified and full-scale war in Europe 126 days ago, is trying now to implement even worse totalitarian, in fact terroristic principles and forms of organization of religious life on that territories of Ukraine which are temporarily occupied. I will not concentrate in too much your attention on this aspect, I mean situation, because it was expressed and in details discussed by previous speakers. I would like to bring your attention just to two significant points directly connected with this problematic. First one is about absolutely dominating in Ukraine approach toward the issue of religious freedom. I think everybody understands that what I mean, but I will elaborate a little bit. Despite Russia, for many centuries, Ukraine has been a polyconfessional state. So an idea of religious diversity is genetically present in the Ukrainian society. Just one example, which can help to discover the main tendency. Even in 4 months before obtaining its full independence in 1991, Ukrainian parliament adopted a special law on religious freedom and religious organizations, which guarantees and provides all necessary conditions for experiencing real freedom for all religious institutions. Even in current war realities, Ukraine continues this politics and creates for religious institutions any possibilities to fulfill from their side objective spiritual aims and tasks. I am sure international experts can confirm this my statement. My second and final for this moment point is about necessity and even obligation of attracting international attention to the dramatic, critical and extremely difficult situation on that regions of Ukraine which are under occupation. Some of them, like Crimea and Donbass, for almost 8 years, and of other regions that are occupied for several months. Exactly, Ukraine will do everything possible to liberate these regions and to reinstall implementation of the Ukrainian law, which guarantee everybody non-artificial freedom of religion. But for reaching this desirable for everybody moment, liberation territories and return of Ukrainian laws, I would stress to vitally important to receive essential and appropriate help from international community and international organization. Please convince your governments, parliaments, concrete leaders to provide Ukraine any kind of help and assistance. Military one, humanitarian help, help on political level, help through withdrawal Russia from any international contacts and possibility to continue this war. The war which causes dozens of thousands of killed, including civilians, and the war which brings terrible limitation of religious freedom on all territories affected by war. I am sure that the issue of finishing the war is a matter of expansion of religious freedom and returning to real freedom on all Ukrainian territories. Second aspect is objective necessity to increase involvement of different international organizations which are analyzing and tracking the issue of religious freedom, into monitoring the situation and offering models as well as projects that can improve the situation. When I'm talking about international organizations, I mean all system of institution and organized event that can understand realities and can react on these realities. It is exactly what our distinctive and honorable meeting is doing right now. And I wish for all other events in frame of this annual meeting today and tomorrow on the second day of its work to be very productive and extremely effective in terms of influencing the situation in any places that are in need for international help and constructive interference. Thank you so much.
Ambassador Juraš, thank you very much. Дуже дякую. And thank you for that wonderful insight. And to all of our panelists, thank you again for taking the time to be with us today and for opening up, I think, for all of us, a greater insight into the situation with the war in Ukraine and its religious dimensions and the impact on religious freedom more broadly in the region. Thank you also for your own presence. We hope that you have a good rest of the summit. Thank you.